Morning. I'm John Disterhoft from Northwestern University Feinberg School of Medicine in Chicago. So session 5 is how do we validate approaches that aim to harness reserve to improve the aging brain? We have 4 really exciting talks, and the first one is by Lon White from the Pacific Health Research and Education Institute in Honolulu. He's going to speak to us on brain reserve, cognitive reserve, and brain comorbidity together determine resilience in neuropathologic Alzheimer's disease. So, Lon.
Thank you. Today I'm going to describe an approach that we are trying to develop to actually measure resilience using our available data. The idea in this is that if we could put a number on a person's reserve, it could then become a dependent variable against which to look for its associations, not just with education and occupation, bilinguality, but with a great number of things. For us in Hawaii, that's very important because we have data going back 50 years that describes things like grip strength, pulmonary function, hemoglobin, diabetes. So things that might exist 30, 40, 50 years prior to the potential onset of disease is something we could look for as contributing to resilience. To do this, we need to develop and to validate a method for measuring and estimating it. The Oxford English Dictionary has a specific definition of resilience, which is the ability to rebound from or to tolerate an assault or an injury of any kind. Operationally for us, looking at the origins of the concepts of reserve and resilience, to me this means basically the capacity, the demonstrated capacity of an individual to sustain cognitive functioning at a normal or at least non-demented level despite the accumulation of the brain lesions that are associated with dementia. So the assault in this case, the insult, is the accumulation of those brain lesions. This requires, if we're going to do this, to demonstrate the presence of resilience, we need 2 things. We need to measure the existence and the quantity of the assault, of the injury, and also the cognitive performance during the period of rebound or sustained. Both of those things are needed. Now, at the moment, and I'll show you some data in a little bit, the measurement of the insult, of the assault, histopathologically goes well beyond what you can see with neuroimaging. So if we want a precise measure of the assault, of the injury to the brain, we can't be satisfied completely with neuroimaging, but we're going to need to look at the brain tissue. And the measurements of cognition, we have to be aware of what the level of cognitive functioning was before, so we really need some longitudinal data. A lot of what I'm going to be showing you now was published in a paper published in Neurology in March of last year. Basically what we showed when we looked at 744 brain autopsies and looked for associations of the many variables we searched for in those brains with cognition prior to death, we identified 5 specific kinds of lesions. The key thing about this is we searched about 1,600 observations in the brain to do this, and about 600 from the gross. And these are really what we came up with as the key factors. When we'd identified these factors in each brain of the 744 brains, we assigned severities, and the severities had been generated by, in a circular way, comparing how much of these lesions we needed to produce dementia with high odds ratios. So a severe association was a level of the lesion which gave us an odds ratio of about 4, and moderate gave us an odds ratio associated with cognitive impairment prior to death of about 2. And below that, we considered it negligible. To come up with a total score, we simply added these together. So 5 of these added together, which meant that we came up with a total brain insult, total brain pathology burden that had a maximum possible of 5. And we observed values of 0 to 4, which means that there were a significant number of people who had severe levels of all 4 of these different lesions. It's important to realize that those 4 different kinds of lesions were almost entirely mutually independent. So they were totally different disease processes as far as we could tell. So this shows you the burden index that we got. So again, the purpose of this is step 1 in resilience is to measure the severity of the insult. So this is an index of the total burden of pathology we looked at. And as you can see, it goes all the way from 0, obviously with decreasing numbers, potentially down to 5. We looked at this in data from the Honolulu Asia Aging Study and also the Nun Study. These are the data from the Nun Study. So what this shows is on the horizontal axis is the increasing pathologic burden. The bars show the percentage that's black is severe cognitive impairment, and then an intermediate level is the gray on top of it. The key thing you need to see here is absolutely there's this tremendously strong association. Now, a variable, a value of 1 here means that there was one kind of lesion at a severe level, and less than half of those people had been severely impaired. The overall message from this paper, this was the same thing, by the way, from the Honolulu Asia Aging Study. The key thing from this paper is that in terms of causing dementia, the individual impact of any type of single lesion, including the Alzheimer's lesions, were far less important than the summed effect of all of those lesions. So this is Murphy's Law in action, and that's what causes most dementia. So this table basically shows you the distribution of the burden score that I've described in 269 individuals who were either flat out or severely impaired. The reason those are separated was because there were some people who'd been severely impaired who declined to come back for the full evaluation. So we could not fairly call them demented, even though they almost certainly were. We just couldn't finish the exam. So what you see here is among the people who were demented, 4% of them had totally clean brains. There were no lesions of any kind that we could see. Another 7% had a little bit of one of those kinds of lesions. 9% had 2 lesions at a moderate level. So you can see basically what this shows is that the amount and types of lesions associated varied all over the board. And there were a lot of people with multiple lesions. As you can see in the sort of brownish and red, really the largest number of people by far had multiple lesions. So 26% of these people had at least 2 different kinds of lesions, severe degrees. Now this doesn't, a lot of them were vascular lesions, but they're also Lewy bodies, extreme atrophy in the absence of anything else, or hippocampal sclerosis. Now we did the same thing with those individuals who had not been demented. And what you see here is that 54% of them had either no lesions at all or just a single lesion at moderate degree. So there were a lot of people in the green and the brown and the red on this who in fact had been unimpaired and yet had lesions. So this is where we're beginning to look at evidence of resilience. So then the question is, if we want a numeric resilience index, so we can assign that to an individual and say, this is how much resilience this person demonstrated, To do that meaningfully, we're first of all going to have to measure the severity and amount of the insult, which we believe at this point you can really only get adequately from pathology. In order to show resilience, they not only have to have pathology, the insult has to be there, but they in fact have to show that they tolerated it or bounced back from it. So you need both. So that really says there's no way of measuring resilience if a person doesn't have an insult or if they don't bounce back at all. Either way, you can't do it the way we've described this. So there were 269 people who had negligible pathology. There are 115 who had marginal cognitive impairment, and for these initial analyses, I put those aside so we could really look at the really ones that were clearly okay and the ones that were clearly not okay. There were 63 people that I said had zero resilience. Now, when you do a scale that's numeric, you like to have people who had a zero value. So to show no resilience, what it seems to me intuitively the best way to do that is to show that yes, there was an insult, but the person did not rebound from it. So to have no resilience at all, if you had a lot of insult, then you might have some resilience, but not enough to do it. So I defined a value of zero resilience as having modest levels of pathology, and still they were demented. There were 63 such people. The second idea of this is to demonstrate resilience. It should take more resilience with a worse insult. So if you had a really bad insult, no matter if you did have some resilience, you might not be able to see it. So I decided that the index ought to be equivalent to the assault that had to be responded to. So I used the same number that we got from the pathology burden for those people who had apparently not surrendered to the lesion itself. So that shows that there were 10 out of this 222 people that I could measure resilience in that had very high resilience. 15 who had high resilience, 55 who had moderate resilience. So what I'm basically saying, and this is demonstrated resilience. So they may have been able to deal with greater insults, but they demonstrated it for this. So this shows you the data in a bit more detail. So zero resilience, you had to be demented, but with low levels of pathology. High resilience, at an index value of 3, you couldn't be demented because the idea is that's the way you show resilience, and yet you had to have a really very high amount of brain burden pathologically. Doing that, it allowed us to assign to 222 individuals a demonstrated resilience index, which we could then use as a dependent variable. Now, I did this about 3 weeks ago, so that we haven't looked at a whole lot of data yet. We will look at a lot of stuff. We have, as I mentioned, data that goes back 50 years on these people. We have data on pulmonary function, on polysomnography, on sex hormone levels, on CRP, fibrinogen. We have a huge amount of things that we will go back and ask, do any of these predict resilience? And the idea that I have basically is that reserve is something that we've thought of like as how big is your brain, how good is your brain, how much software or hardware, as Yakov mentioned before, do you have to work with? We should all be able to measure those before people get demented and in people who are not demented. But the point of this is resilience. If resilience is a characteristic like elasticity, you can't measure the actual dynamic characteristic until the individual has shown it to you by developing the abnormality and then responding to it. So what I've done so far is simply taken this index of resilience that's been generated with our data from the Honolulu-Asia Aging Study for 222 people, used it as a dependent variable, and asked what predicts it. And the only two things with this index that thus far have predicted it are education and usual lifetime occupation complexity. Now, the difficulty in this analysis is those are tightly related. When they were both in the model, they both didn't quite become statistically significant. When they were in the model one at a time, either one of them was strongly protective. Age at death was absolutely not associated. So this suggests that resilience doesn't change with age. ApoE4 didn't affect it, suggested that doesn't as well. The intracranial volume, which is the way we think about how big the brain was in early adult life, also did not predict it. Height did not predict it. Heart disease, which we're careful to measure in the study because it started off as a study of heart disease and stroke, did not predict it, nor diabetes. So in conclusion, we are playing with this idea of how to use real data to come up with a real index, a real indicator of demonstrated resilience. And those are the data that I've shown you. As a result of that, we assign this index to everybody who we can safely do it for, using as zero the evidence of no resilience in individuals who had a small amount of pathology. And as I've shown you, it's associated with education and occupation, and thus far we've seen nothing else. But we've just begun to scratch the surface with what we can look at in our data. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. Jakob.
Thanks, Lon. I knew I would enjoy it, and I did. What you're talking about, I think, is close to what people have tried to do. Rich mentioned it yesterday, these models that people have done where they try to segregate the variance in cognition associated with brain measures and with demographic measures, and what's left you could call resilience or reserve. But what you have, which is so much better, is you have the actual, first of all, they're demented people where you can see this in action, and you have the actual path.
Yeah.
So I think what's different about this than the proxies is what's good about these other kind of variance measures is that it's a direct measure, as opposed to the kind of formative measures that we were talking about yesterday. It's a direct measure of what reserve or resilience could be. So I think it's a great idea. It should be pushed forward.
Thank you, Yaffa. We did start with the idea of residuals after putting in all of the other variables. And what we found was, in that case, yes, education, occupation. But you're right, we weren't quite, because it doesn't make a good dependent variable to look for factors. Thank you, Jakob.
Yeah, that was a terrific talk. Did you look at intracranial vascular pathology at all, athero, Burkhardt-Robin spaces that might correlate with your findings?
The problem with that is that it's basically part of one of the lesions that contributes to the insult. So one of the routine things we do in all of our autopsies is look very carefully at the vasculature from the arch all the way up to the circle into the brain, and we do look at the Burkhardt-Robin spaces. We look at everything we could think of. When we've looked at those before and then did a residual analysis, we find that we can explain all of the variants associated with those descriptions of atherosclerosis with just counting the number of lacunar and microinfarcts. So my view is that what you've described are the factors which represent pathogenesis of those ischemic lesions. But we really believe that it's the chronic ischemia from small vessel disease associated with everything you've mentioned that drives a gradual injury to neurons. So that's why we didn't do it. It would be going back to the same variables you were using in the dependent variable. Thank you.
I'm not sure we have time for all of you, but go ahead. Yeah.
So it was a great talk. One of the issues, of course, when you're looking at autopsy data is you don't know where the people are going to go from there. So have you looked back and seen, are the people, so if they're starting off from a higher point but moving down at the same rate, are they really resilient? Or are they just get the benefit of starting off at a higher place?
That's a key issue. And I think what it relates to is something we've mentioned here before is we're all interested in intercept and slopes. as a characteristic of the process that produces dementia. And in some people, that intercept, because they were had cognitive functioning just above the threshold, at a different time, other people descended a long time. My own expectation is we're going to find that the slope especially, but also the intercept, is also reflective of the total burden of comorbid sorts of pathology. But I think that's the key issue, and that's one of the projects that I'll be working with going back, is to look at that trajectory from before, at the inflection point, and to death. Absolutely. Thank you.
Very quick, please.
I'm curious about the opposite group, the non-resilient people. So what about those individuals who had a diagnosis of dementia, but they have very low scores on your pathology index?
I think that's a really key issue. And I think for our way to first look at that, the first thing we will do is address this question of intercept and slope. My guess would be that the people that we are able to see, because they demonstrate to us, yes, they are demented with little pathology, is that they will likely have low education, their reserves will be low already, and they'll have a single type of lesion. I hope that's what we find, because it would support our hypotheses. But those are incredibly, because what we're really trying to deal with here is understanding the pathogenesis and the course of the process using pathology that we only get once when people die, and trying to infer from whatever data we get what went on for the previous 5, 10, 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lon.